Coleman.
A couple of days ago, I was talking about the definition of done for recruitment. There was a process where people were being recruited into the organization. Today, I want to talk about a definition of done for an IT operations team. A team that does a lot of systems maintenance, network maintenance, a lot of kind of IT, say in a bank or something like that. And most of the work that the team does is operational, granting granting access to systems, creating privileged roles, creating network zones, various ways of granting access to systems, but also maybe troubleshooting systems as well when things aren't going so well. Later on, we'll talk about such teams also doing some project work, because often these teams have some continual improvement projects to do as well, or there's some developments that leadership have decided in their own wisdom to increase the utilization of their operations team, something that I'm not sure I'm a big fan of, but we'll talk about that maybe later on today. So an IT operations team, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to consider what are the types of work that are going through the system. So if I was to imagine a situation where maybe one of the items was maybe getting access to servers. Typically, a product backlog item might have some kind of acceptance criteria. So for example, maybe you want to check that there's a valid request. And then maybe we're going to grant access if the request is valid. And then maybe we get the client to confirm that indeed they have the access and that it's working maybe 15 minutes later. We also need to make sure that we only give the access that's needed, that we don't give any more access than is actually needed, because in this particular context, there would be lots of information security, data privacy considerations, and so on. And let's imagine granting access to a server in this particular organization. There's no real review required from somebody else. You just grant the access. You just apply due diligence when you do that, and that's very straightforward. So that's getting access to servers. Imagine there's another one where we're maybe creating network zones, and maybe the acceptance criteria here would be the user would specify the zone name and the reason for having it created, and they'd estimate when they want it done. We'd check if the reason is valid, and maybe we'd confirm the viability of the date as well. If it's unreasonable, we would come up with a more realistic date. Then we would implement it. We would do some testing. We would confirm with the client that the zone is working, and we'd close the ticket and maybe seek some informal feedback. Very simple one. Another one might be maybe we're creating privileged roles. So the acceptance criteria might be, again, checking if there's a valid request. The access would be granted and only give the access that's needed. Maybe, again, no review is required, and then the ticket is closed. And if there's a problem, they'll come back to us, kind of thing. If there's troubleshooting, maybe we need some kind of reproducible steps. Maybe we need some good report on what's wrong. So some screen recording or screenshot with supporting information, with a clear set of steps to reproduce the issue, or maybe just to confirm that it's an intermittent issue. We might need to get some logs to give us more details. We might need to reproduce the issue, diagnose the issue, and then present options to fix our workaround. Sometimes we can't fix it because we can't reproduce it. So some kind of workaround, or we're trying to build up confidence that the issue has gone away again. And then again, we see confirmation from the client that the issue can be closed, and we close the ticket. So there are a few examples. Another one, for example, might be maybe there's a system blah, 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 cloud requests, and we just check that the customer is using the appropriate workflow, and we direct the client to that workflow. Maybe there's some wiki page that they can look at, and we just confirm to them that that's the correct one, and that they're following it, and then confirm everything's okay with the client, and we close the ticket. So even though the work is different, there's a lot of similarities between these items. There's an escalation of urgency as well, which could be any of the above. There's a lot of similarity between those product backlog items. And one of the things that's useful about a definition of done is you don't have to repeat what's common across all your product backlog items. You can, you can isolate what's the same, and then kind of proceed on that basis. And so that would be something we need to kind of check in on. And so if you were to do that, possibly what could happen is you might be able to identify that actually there are quite a few things in common. Maybe the first thing that's in common is we clarify the work. A number of steps within there, like, for example, requesting that their incident report or service request, just asking them to write down what they want clearly, maybe looking for a clear problem statement, and just making sure that we understand what the problem is. Maybe aligning with the client as well. It's all very well for them to write it down, but maybe talking with the client, whether that's through instant messaging or some kind of call or something like that. So clarifying the work might be one step, and then doing the work itself. So you do the work, and maybe there's some there was some automation that was supposed to be in place, but it's not quite working. So you might have to manually complete some things. Maybe there was some maybe you're using some tool, I don't know, ServiceNow or something like that, and there's some automation supposed to happen when someone makes a request. It didn't actually happen. Maybe you need to manually complete that. Maybe we need to liaise with people that we depend on. Maybe you need to create some automated tests. Because manual testing is kind of evil, kind of expecting people to repeat tests. Also, if somebody patches the system, we need some confidence that the system is still okay. So knowing that all those regression tests are there in the background gives us confidence that the systems are still working even after we've done some major upgrades to the system. We probably test in some kind of integrated testing environment, and then we'd maybe confirm that the end-to-end testing is okay. And we probably do some exploratory testing, confirm that's okay. We probably do some non-functional testing, like, I don't know, performance or security, penetration test or whatever, depending on what the team decides, because maybe you don't need to do that all the time. And if it's a production request, maybe there's some kind of change control board or something like that. We need to put in some requests, and there's some kind of lead time with that, maybe 2 days or something like that. And if there's a number of different groups that need to give approval for that change in production, maybe we have to wait until all those approvals come in before we actually kind of deploy, if you like. Then there might be some kind of manual testing step, as in testing in the testing environment. Maybe getting some senior technical person to test it in the production environment. Maybe checking with some vendors if there's some vendors involved. Maybe verifying the sufficiency of the automated tests that we created. Are they giving us enough coverage in terms of functionality and in terms of scenarios? And then maybe we manually run those automated tests until there's no known issues. And then the final step might be a request closure. So the request permission from the client to close the ticket and to rework if there's a problem, and then maybe repeat the request if needed. But ideally, if it's all sorted, we close the ticket, and then we might look for some kind of star rating and maybe some suggestions for improvement as well. Something I quite like is if you do ask for a 5-star rating or something like that, and if it's not a 5-star, what do we need to do to get a 5-star? We can get some nice suggestions with that. So even though a lot of these requests were different, there were some things that were quite similar on them. And so if you had a Scrum board, then imagine you did a Scrum board with the product backlog might not be in the Scrum board, but you'd have your sprint backlog, which is like a to-do list for the sprint of the product backlog items that are happening. Maybe some doing column you could have subtasks in there as well, and some done column. You could basically specify in terms of what you could specify that something can't move from doing to done until we've actually completed our definition of done. So the idea of definition of done is that we're trying to be consistent about how we do things around here, and it's the minimum standard. It's not like an optional thing. You can specify some things that are optional, like I mentioned, like the non-functional, but you make it clear that it's optional, but everything else would be pretty much mandatory. And so that would help the team to understand when a work item can move from, say, doing to done. Something I prefer, teams that professional Scrum with Kanban, or teams that even just use Kanban, they might have a Kanban board rather than a Scrum board, and so they could have, the product backlog is optional in Kanban, but let's say they've got some kind of to-do column. What you could do is you could break up that definition of done by step. So clarify request has a number of exit criteria. So in the definition of done part that we had a while ago, what was this? How do we know that we clarified the request when we did these things? How do we know that we did the work? How do we know that we tested the work? How do we know that we confirmed closure? That's another way of doing your definition of done. You're basically breaking up the definition of done exit criteria by column. And it's a bit kind of easier to digest because when you just walk by, you can kind of see very quickly, oh, there's one item that's in clarify request, for example, that's not ready to go into do the work yet because the clarification hasn't been done. And there's another item that happens to be in testing at the moment. But because Scrum teams have short sprints, they tend not to have the steps and columns like that, but some teams find it useful. This is all very well, but this example is for an IT operations team with support work. What do you do if they then also do project work? Project work is different by nature. Usually somebody specifies what they're looking for. They need, there's probably similar steps so at the same time, because you probably still need to clarify the request. What is it? But it might be slightly different wording. Instead of it being an incident report or service request, you could have / project request or something like that. Still trying to, maybe instead of just saying problem statement, it could also be an opportunity that we're trying to capture. So actually, even though project work is different, we will still clarify the work. We will still do the work. Some of the steps might be slightly different. So you might even say, if this is project work, do X. We still do testing. We still want to close the project to see, have we actually satisfied what we've done? We might do some additional things like, confirm that we deliver on the benefits. Are the customers happy? Do we deliver outcomes? All these kind of things. But as such, even though project work is different to IT operations work, there are lots of things that are similar. And so the team could actually come up with a definition of done that shows up what's in common. It's just that your language just needs to be a bit more flexible. So for example, here when I had clarified a request, earlier with just the IT operations work, I had request the client's incident report or service request. I could have changed that to request client's incident report or service request or project request for client accountability, so they're clear about what they're trying to achieve. In the second bullet, instead of saying request a clear problem statement for the incident or service request, I could say request a clear problem statement or opportunity to be availed of for the incident report, service request, or project request. So even though I've added in project work, I can still actually tune my definition of done to suit this. And this really helps the transparency in the team. So when any item moves to done, we know what we did to achieve that. The other thing that I mentioned as well a couple of episodes back is that the definition of done doesn't just contain the technical standards in terms of how we do work around here, but also would consider some product quality considerations. So if there were some international standards that we needed to comply with, if we need to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, if we need to comply with some information security international standard, there might be some maybe references to audit readiness or segregation of duties or things like that. These could all be included also in the definition of done. The key thing, though, as a team is whatever you come up with as your definition of done, you should really challenge yourself as a team and say, well, do we really do all of these? Because if we don't, let's not fool ourselves. So let's be honest about what we really do. And I was at a design thinking training session yesterday, and the lady who was teaching me, she was saying to me, that people often have a kind of a wishful thinking in terms of how they would like to do things, like they like to eat healthy food or they like to give healthy food to their children, but what they actually do might be different. And equally, we might have very nice ideas about what we would like to do in terms of how we deliver work, but what we really do might be different. And it's important that you're honest about what you really do. And then try to use retrospectives in Scrum. You can also use retrospectives in Kanban optionally. I think any good, decent team in agility would be doing something like that, and product management would be retrospecting. And you can then, over time, consider how you would continually improve your definition of done. So I would say don't be tempted to say, well, we're an IT operations team. We can't really come up with a unique definition that suits all of our work because our work is so different and all that kind of thing. I think most teams in the world and all sorts of knowledge work would be able to say that. I think you need to try as a team to align on what done means. If it's easier for you to just have one definition of done, by all means do that in Scrum. In Scrum, it's required. With Kanban, probably the way you would do it is each column in your Kanban board, you'd be very clear what the exit criteria were. So when a team says to me, "How am I allowed to move this item from this column to this column?" Well, I just respond by saying, "Well, what is your policy? What does your policy say? What does the exit criteria for that column say? Does it say that you can move it?" And no, it doesn't. It says we actually have more to do. Well, that's not me to answer. Then it's you. It's your policy. So you can review your policies, of course, but if your exit criteria is saying you need to do X, Y, and Z as well, you probably need to do X, Y, and Z. By having definition of done in Scrum, by having exit criteria in Kanban on your Kanban board columns, you're improving transparency. We're comparing apples with apples when people are looking at whatever you've produced at the end of a sprint, end of a month, whatever your rhythm is. People will know what they're looking at, and there will be more honesty. It'll improve trust. People will feel much more comfortable that when you're showing something that's done, it really is done, and you can then focus on the next item, or maybe even start focusing on validating what you previously delivered before to see whether you delivered on those outcomes, or maybe even do some experimentation on some new ideas that you've been inspired about during the recent time period. Okay, so that's definition of done for an IT operations team. If you have any topics that you'd like to me to talk about on one of these sessions, by all means, just contact me on whichever social media channel you're on, or leave a voicemail at anchor.fm/dailyflow/message. Thank you.